Welcome back to InDaily Live's election special. I'm your host, Will Goodings, joined by Melissa Mack, AM editor of InDaily, Clem McIntyre from the Adelaide University, and John Spoehr too, an Adelaide University representative. What we're going to do is get in and have a little bit of a look at, well, it's something that not just we're doing, and I think media right across the country is doing at the moment. It's a unique sort of time, I think, elections, because not only do we have candidates under the blowtorch and in the spotlight, but media seems to find it's a pretty interesting time for a bit of introspection too. I noticed some articles coming out regarding our major newspapers, News Limited and Fairfax in this country, their political lines that they've sort of fallen in alignment with. But also, now I hadn't seen this done in this country before, but interviewers, Kerry O'Brien and others, having the amount of words they use in interviews analysed to see if there's any inherent bias there. Surely we're getting a bit carried away there, aren't we?
I think there's been a sensitivity amongst the political parties over the way in which the media has covered elections and contentious issues for some time, and I was struck by that too. The print papers, scarcely the most neutral medium that you'll find in terms of election coverage, putting the ruler up against the electronic press. I thought that was interesting.
Absolutely right. Well, we introduced such a topic in this way because we're looking, Mel, at some of your fine work over the course of the campaign, indeed in Independent Weekly and the online addition to that in InDaily.
Yep.
Interested to find out the South Australian angles you've taken.
Yeah, of course, InDaily's covered the breaking news every day. So this week, the Labor campaign launch, Tony Abbott's costings, and leading up to the election tomorrow. But the Independent Weekly's been able to take a bit of a more in-depth look at the big issues. The first week, we took on population. Hendrik Gout he's looked at Julia Gillard's change of vision for Australia, looking at a sustainable population. Then in the second week, we looked at mining and health. Week 3 it took me out to Manapara, spoke to a refugee from Afghanistan who came here on a boat. We sort of cut down into that issue, looking at more of a balanced perspective. Then week 4, obviously, Tony Abbott and Julia Gillard in town. We looked at the River Murray. Hendrik Gout was back for that.
I loved that. I must say that the front page you did have on that article with Tony Abbott where in South Australia was that actually taken? It looked like a beautiful spot, and it sort of just encapsulated the mood perfectly.
Yeah, that was when he came out to South Australia and went towards the mouth of the Murray there.
Yeah, that photo, that there, it's a terrific cover. That's just fantastic. So, as I said at the start, difficulty, of course, in obtaining a South Australian angle when we haven't heard SA-centric policy so much dominate. Okay, there's some things that affect all of us, but what would you say if we get an overarching sort of opinion from the people down at InDaily? Where in this state is this election being won or lost?
I don't know if there's one particular issue.
Okay.
I think South Australians, some of them would vote for personalities, others, depending on where they live, the Murray, or perhaps industrial relations, that kind of thing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess that's just endemic of the type of election campaign we're talking about, isn't it? Not that there's so little massive vision that people will pick and choose what particularly relates to them. We need to go to the news. On the other side of that, we'll continue our election discussion. But right now, it's over to Tineka Everaardt.
Thank you, Will. In the latest election news, the major parties are neck and neck, with this morning's news poll showing the votes now split 50-50 on a two-party preferred basis. Both leaders have come out all guns blazing, hoping to win over undecided voters in a bid to push them over the line to victory. Today, the Prime Minister will continue campaigning in New South Wales, while the opposition leader continues his 36-hour non-stop marathon in Sydney.
This is a stop number 2 in the 36-hour continuous campaign, and there'll be absolutely no doubt that I am working harder than anyone ever has to be the Prime Minister of Australia.
Meanwhile, Julia Gillard is using her last campaign day to mount an attack on the opposition, saying voting for Tony Abbott would affect Australia's future prosperity. Ms Gillard warned the coalition leader has not abandoned work choices and said Australians should not risk electing him. But the opposition's hit back, accusing her of being panic-stricken. In other news, the Australian Democrats have been rocked by a candidate who yesterday withdrew from the federal election after it was revealed he was a convicted sex offender. Democrats leaders say they feel betrayed by the candidate in the seat of Sturt, Darren Andrews. Andrews admitted to a Channel 7 reporter that he'd been convicted of trying to procure a child for sex over the internet. And lastly, in election news, hundreds of punters have raced to place bets on a coalition victory. It comes as opinion polls show late support for Tony Abbott becoming Prime Minister. Leading betting agency Centrebet has seen 3 coalition bets placed for every 1 bet for Labor this morning. That's the latest in election news. Back to you guys on the panel.
Thank you, Tineka. Guys, one thing I want to have a look at now that we've sort of moved beyond rather rapidly, albeit, beyond that broad policy look at things, is a bit of the nuts and bolts and what we can expect to take place tomorrow evening. And the first one I want to have a look at is something that I think has largely escaped the guise of the mainstream media, and that's what might happen in the upper house. Of course, there's a number of very interesting possibilities and outcomes there. What do you expect the makeup to be, Clem?
I can say with some confidence that I think the Greens will hold the balance of power on their own when the new Senate comes in July next year. The Senate we're about to elect don't take up their seats until July the following year. And in fact, if the Greens can win a Senate seat in Canberra in the ACT, then that would have the effect of isolating Steve Fielding. So it would be Greens, Xenophon and Labor would hold a majority between them. So if the Labor government is returned and the Greens senator wins in the ACT, that will change the mood quite quickly. But one way or another, we're going to have a Senate where whichever party, Labor under Gillard, Liberal Nationals under Tony Abbott, they will have to negotiate with the Greens in the Senate.
Well, I'll throw the question then open to both of you. What do you expect the policy ramifications of that to be, the look and feel of the next government, whoever it may well be? What do you expect that to be like, John?
Well, I think it's the Green decade in many ways, politically. The lack of an emissions trading scheme nationally has done a lot of damage, I think, to both parties, but of course to Labor in particular.
Isn't the irony there that the Greens actually voted against it?
It is, but it was the type of emissions trading scheme that they were frustrated with. In principle, they support a carbon tax, which is a variant on that theme, but as a consequence, the Greens are going to pick up a lot of votes. They're going to get a lot of first preference votes. And I think their preferences will go on to Labor, but I agree with Clem that they're looking very good for the Senate, and they'll probably pick up a seat in Melbourne as well.
Possibly, yeah.
Clem, you got an idea of the look and feel of a government with the Greens holding the balance of power?
Well, I think it will force whichever party's in power to really think about the sorts of negotiations and compromises that will be forced over legislation. But I think for me the most interesting thing, it will be excluding Tasmania, where the Greens are in a sort of a more formal coalition. It'll be the first time in Australia that we've seen the Greens actually in a position of influence on their own, and in a sense that's going to put a bit of acid on the Greens. They're going to be answerable and responsible for the policies that they negotiate. In the past, they've been able to try and influence legislation debates, but they've never, in a sense, been accountable for the consequences of those because other numbers were around them. This time, it'll be down to them on their own, and that will, I think that'll change the expectations, in a sense, of the voters for the Greens over the next 3 years.
So it'll almost change, you think, the Greens themselves as much as it may well change the makeup of the government?
Yeah, they're going to have to stop being just critics from the side, arguing in a sense sometimes some quite idiosyncratic positions, knowing that they're never in a position to ever put them into place. They will be in a position of influence, and how they play that. We saw what that did to the Democrats in 1998 when they had to deal with debates over the GST. The Greens may well find themselves caught between some pretty difficult policy decisions, and that will how they play that will be really important in their, as John's suggesting, a Green decade. The Greens will want to keep growing. I think a lot will depend on how the next 3 years plays out.
And of course, the difficulty for the Greens is that Bob Brown can't stay around forever. I mean, he's a very, very popular leader, but they're going to have to think about succession sometime in the future. Yeah,
sometime perhaps in the rather near future. Can we then have a look at the lower house, where the government will of course be formed? There's, speaking of different possibilities and outcomes here, it's just about anything that we noticed today in the news poll. Tineka mentioned in the news, two-party preferred now. It looks neck and neck. We could even have the first hung parliament in some almost 50 years.
More than that,
even more than
70 years.
70 years. That just shows my maths ability, that's all right. Didn't take that at Flinders, incidentally, so let's not knock on the program there. Can we even have the particularly bizarre scenario where it comes down to Bob Catter determining who forms government? Or is that just too bizarre?
Yes, in a word. Yes to both questions.
Yeah, okay then. Righto. Well, then perhaps then, what do you expect, Clem? What would you...
Well, at the moment, with absolutely no confidence, I still think that the Labor Party might just get over the line, might have an absolute bare winning majority, 70 78 seats, something like that, maybe 3 or 4 seat majority. But I say that with no confidence. A movement of a couple of hundred votes in a couple of critical seats could push it the other way. There is every chance that there will be a hung parliament. We could have the major parties on 73, the coalition 73, Labor 73, 3 independents who are from a Conservative background and 1 Green. We could have Labor on, say, 75, not 50% of the parliament, but needing 1 more vote for a majority, wanting to talk to the Green. And it's not impossible for the coalition to pick up the 17 seats it needs to rule in its own right. So all 3 options are alive at the moment.
Quite remarkable, John.
Look, I think the polling might underestimate where the youth vote's going at the moment. Okay. And this is the nature of polling these days. Around about 50% of people have mobile phones now, so most polling, traditionally is done on fixed lines. So it's very difficult for pollsters to pick up the youth vote in an accurate way, and I suspect that that's flowing pretty strongly to the Greens and to Labor at the moment. So I think I'd agree with Clem. I see Labor getting across the line only marginally, but with the help of the youth vote.
Can we then have a look perhaps at more specifically some of the seats that are coming to question? The majority of these are in New South Wales and Queensland. Is there anywhere we can look at and say, well, this might give us an early indication of, if not a uniform swing, just sort of where voter sentiment might well be?
Well, for me, one of the first seats I'll be looking at is Lindsay in the western suburbs of Sydney. Lindsay's around the area where we saw a swing of about 25% in a state by-election in New South Wales recently around Penrith. If there's a swing of in the order of even 10% or something like that in a seat like Lindsay, that suggests to me that the whole of Western Sydney will be moving away from Labor, and we're probably going to see some similar results in Queensland as well. I think there's about 5 seats that are now deemed to be Labor because of the redistribution, but are held by Liberals. I would expect the Liberal Party to win all 5 of those notionally Labor seats, and then they're wanting to try and pick up some of the very narrow margins that Labor won seats, particularly in the southeast of Queensland and in Western Sydney and the north coast of New South Wales of the last election. Then we keep our eye on Victoria because there's a couple of chances there where Labor will win a couple of seats back against that tide. And lastly, look, it might come down to how a couple of seats in Western Australia, of course, 2 hours behind us. We might be up very late waiting for results from Hasluck and Swan and perhaps Canning in Western Australia. And if there's a 1 or 2 seats in it, we won't know tomorrow night. We'll have to wait for postals, absentees to come in, and it could be a pretty long and anxious wait for the party leaders.
We might not well know. Yeah, well, Tony Abbott's already said he's got a couple of nights of sleeplessness. It might indeed extend to a couple more.
It might keep going.
That's right, Mel. The one that we didn't mention just then, Boothby in South Australia is widely regarded as probably the most marginal or contentious.
Most likely to change, I'd say.
Most
not
likely
most
to change.
marginal.
Sorry, most likely to change. You got a feeling or read on Boothby covered in InDaily at all?
We did cover the seat. At the moment, some people are saying it's looking like Labor could pick it up. The Labor candidate, Annabel Dogans, has been campaigning pretty hard there. But Andrew Southcott's held it for 14 years. His margin has been slipping every year. And I think, Clem, you said if Labor didn't select Nicole Corns in 2007, it could have been a marginal Labor seat this year.
Well, well, I don't know that Labor was going to win it, but what was interesting, in 2007, the Labor primary vote fell, but the two-party preferred vote went up. So that said to me, some people weren't happy with the candidate, but they also wanted to back the Kevin 07 campaign. With a better candidate, with no disrespect to Nicole Corns, but a less contentious candidate, Labor may get a few more votes, and Andrew Southcott may be in trouble there, but it's very tight.
John, Boothby first, and then indeed other seats you think of interest, or certainly regions?
Well, more broadly, I think this is all about the science of marginal seat campaigning these days, and Labor proved very, very good at that at the last state election. I'm sure the coalition's learnt a lot from that particular experience and is focusing their resources in the marginals. But it's very difficult to tell exactly what's happening down, on the street, in the streets at this stage. But I'm expecting that a lot of resources, a lot of people are pounding the pavement at the moment from both of the parties to try and win over the those last votes in the last hours of the campaign.
The campaigning is almost arguably at its hardest at the moment. Both leaders crisscrossing the country doing as much media just about as possible.
Which says they're really worried.
Yeah, absolutely right. It's a key indicator. Well, we've actually run out of time, gentlemen, and Mel, so we'll have to leave you there with that. Thank you very much for being part of our panel today.
Pleasure.
John Spoehr, Clem McIntyre, indeed, Mel Mack from InDaily. Make sure you check them out for all of your election coverage needs and interests. We hope you have a wonderful weekend. Happy voting, and we'll see you Monday.